nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam shri radhika prananatha pāda-saroruhāgraṁ yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam shri gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilasujjitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananudavam Murdnani Patyakshito Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam dantoir yacheham puna puna Shrimadrupa parambojo dhyudisyam janma janmani Abhirapali patiputra kanta Dasya bilashati balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada-kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatupada Padme Bhakterya Nikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Krite Anandati Shaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Padam Bhajayugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Yakarya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Tasyai Bhaktyai Namaha Yaramya Nikilarta Shangashamani Shrotratritim Sangata Yad Swadhyai Rasika Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hiraye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna, Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire in this world, Shri Rupa Goswami Pad. Again today we will resume our discussion of Padyavali, and in particular we'll conclude the prakaran on utkanta, or the longing of bhaktas for Bhagavan, for bhakti. So we come now to we'll pick up from verse 107. We last heard two verses by Shri Rupa Goswami himself, and he quotes a few others to conclude this section, and if we have time then we'll start also the following section. So, from verse 107 in the fresh file. Next, the compiler cites an expression of longing for Sri Kṛṣṇa from an author absorbed in Vatsalya Bhava. Utphulla-tāpiñcha-manorama-śrīr mātuḥ stana-nyasta-mukhāravindaḥ sañcālayan pāda-saroruhāgraṁ Kṛṣṇa kadā yāsyati dṛk-pathaṁ. Of charming hue, like a fully blossoming tamal, his lotus mouth fixed on the breast of his mother, wiggling the tips of his lotus feet. When will Kṛṣṇa enter the path of my vision? So, as we discussed in reference to the previous verses, by this question of when will I see this, by phrasing this description in the form of a question and in the form of a temporal question, then the verse is understood to convey utkanta, or longing. As we discussed, utkanta was defined as this intense desirousness, and alternately eagerness was defined as the intolerance or inability to tolerate or sustain the passage of time. So here, that's also being looped in, or lumped in, if you will, as the larger category subsumes the subcategory. So when will I see means it's difficult to wait any longer. So in that way it conveys longing. And then the image of Kṛṣṇa is related specifically to vatsalya bhav. So for the most part we see Rupa Goswami is citing all verses that either depict Kṛṣṇa in general or Kṛṣṇa specifically in the midst of Madhura Rasa Lila. But not 100%. In other words, there are this verse, and we'll see a few other verses later in the Padyavali, where on occasion or rarely some description of Kṛṣṇa as he's specifically envisioned and cherished and longed to be served by those who foster affinity for other forms of rati are also found. So Kṛṣṇa's charming hue, like a fully blossoming tamal. So the tamal tree is known for its dark, rich colored bark. So this is said to be reminiscent of Kṛṣṇa's swarthy complexion. And then he's depicted as with his lotus mouth fixed on the breast of his mother, means she's nursing him. And the commentator explains that wiggling the toes while suckling is known, to be a characteristic of a happy baby. So perhaps this is the most charming feature of the verse, or in other words, to add this touch, if you will, of a specific endearing image that indicates both the satisfaction of Kṛṣṇa as well as the beauty of Kṛṣṇa at the same time, since baby toes are especially endearing, being tender and small and usually a bit glossy, a bit as they're often compared to the pallavas, or the fresh sprigs on certain types of vines. This sort of bright, glossy, very tender appearance is satisfying to behold. So by depicting here Kṛṣṇa wiggling the tips of his lotus feet, then the reader's mind's eye is drawn both to the beauty and tenderness and minuteness of those tips, as well as the pleasure of knowing that Kṛṣṇa is pleased. So, like this, we have verse 107. Next, the compiler cites another verse of longing, in which the author describes his mind's fixation upon Sri Kṛṣṇa's figure and face. Rohiṇī-ramaṇa-maṇḍala-dyuti, drohiṇīṁ vadana-kānti-santatim, Kṛṣṇa nūtana-tamāla-komalāṁ, tava tanuṁ vismaret. O Kṛṣṇa, who can forget the radiance of your face? The foe of the splendor of the halo of Rohiṇī's beloved, or your flawless figure softer than a young tamal tree. So compositionally, this verse has a bit of special features of its sound and choice of syllables. You have rohiṇī and drohiṇī at the beginning of the first two lines, and then you have the third line ending with komalāṁ, and then you have the fourth line beginning by way of a different use of sandhi, the same apparent word or the same sound, which is actually two different words, ka and amalam. So by sandhi that becomes komalāṁ. So you get this alliteration from these choices of words. So he's saying, who can forget the radiance of your face and your flawless figure? Quote, Rohiṇī's beloved refers to the moon. So the moon is said to be married to the 27 nakshatras, or the 27 constellations that span the path of the moon's visual orbit. So the word Ramana can mean beloved, or it can also more generally mean husband or cause of delight. So by this, why does the author choose to, there are so many Sanskrit words for the moon, why does he come with this one, Rohiṇī's beloved? So by using a word for the moon that alludes to the moon's presence in the midst of a nakshatra, there is you could say a specifically vivid evocation of the moon shining brightly on the backdrop of stars. So and also that the word Ramana, I've given it here as beloved, but it can also mean a cause of pleasure or a cause of delight. So how is it that the moon delights his wife Rohiṇī? By shining beautifully in her midst. So this name evokes that sense of the radiance and the beauty of the moon. So then by saying that the radiance of your face is like the foe of the splendor of the halo of Rohiṇī's beloved, means that the moon is frightened, or the moon is outdone by the brightness, the luminosity of Krishna's face. So the author describes the radiance of Sri Krishna's face as a foe of the moon's splendor, to indicate that although the moon's halo is bright and filled with nectarian rays, the radiance of Sri Krishna's face belittles that, with its superlatively luminous luster, the nectar it emits through its luster, its gestures, its speech, and its flute music. In other words, the moon, it's bright, and there's said to be nectar in its rays, we agree. But Krishna's face, it's even brighter, it has even better nectar, and it has many more features as well. It has gestures, it has speech, it has music, so there's no comparison. Moreover, regarding Sri Krishna's figure, the author indicates that although a young tamal tree is soft and has a rich, dark color, Sri Krishna's figure is even softer and replete with an even more attractive hue. And again, because this is the prakaran on longing, then the way that the description is couched is, who can forget the radiance of your face or your flawless figure, means I can't forget them, means I can't stop thinking about them. So when does the mind become absorbed such that it can't stop thinking about an object? When someone deeply desires an object, or when someone is filled with intense longing for an object, then they, so to speak, can't get it off their mind. So by saying, who can forget, he's not only saying that I cannot forget, but that I'm so feeling such intense desire that I cannot forget, and that I'm filled with the impression that everyone else must feel like this too. So when someone feels something very deeply, they can either assume that everyone else must feel it as well, or forget that everyone else isn't and just assume that they are. So this also, by speaking not only in first person and saying, I can't forget, but by saying, who could forget, then that conveys an even further intensity of longing. So, next, the compiler concludes this section on expressions of Bhakta's longing, utkanta, with a verse in which the author expresses his desire to receive a glance from Sri Kṛṣṇa while he is in the midst of Lila with the gopis of Braja. So he says, barhāpīḍaṁ maulau vibhrad vaṁśī-nādān ātanvan nānākalpa-śrī-sampanno gopa-strībhiḥ saṁvītaḥ netrānandaṁ kurvan Kṛṣṇa tvam charasman vikṣetaḥ sarve kāma sampader rayanasmakam hridyasinaḥ. Wearing a peacock plume chaplet atop your topknot, playing the flute, replete with the beauty of various ornaments, surrounded by cowherd women, and delighting the eyes. O Kṛṣṇa, if you would glance towards us, all the desires sitting on our hearts would be fulfilled. So to convey longing, he's saying that all the desires I have pertain to you. You are the object of them all. So if I were to receive a glance from you, that would fulfill all the desires that I have. So that would, the implication being that my longing for you is so great, I don't desire anything else. And even such an intense feeling of longing is there that even just a glance from you would be completely fulfilling. So when someone feels both great desire as well as great adoration for someone, then they can feel that they would be highly blessed by even a slight contact or a slight gesture from such a person. Perhaps a comparison in the world we see sometimes, teenagers or others will adore celebrities, and if they, attend a concert or, some other public function and they just see the celebrity on the stage, or the celebrity is walking off the football mat, the football pitch, or the, court or whatever, and gives them a high five or something like that on the way home, on their way out. That's something that person will remember for their entire life. I got a high five from such and such champion, or I got a wave from such and such star. So someone would, feel like this was a priceless moment in their life. So something like that, this person is saying that if you would just glance towards us, all our desires would be fulfilled. There would be nothing else to desire, just to even receive your glance even once. So in that way, longing is conveyed. The author's description of Sri Kṛṣṇa being, quote, replete with the beauty of various ornaments may be envisioned by reference to the summary of Sri Kṛṣṇa's primary ornaments given by the compiler in his Radha Krishna Ganodesh Deepika. So this is an attempt at an illustration. In other words, if the author is saying he's wearing various ornaments, then, well, what kind of ornaments? The verse itself doesn't specify, and no doubt elsewhere here in Padyavali, many times certain features of Krishna's ornamentation is touched upon. But for good measure, we can see how Rupa Goswami writes a relatively elaborate summary of the ornaments Kṛṣṇa may, on a given day, elect to wear. So not that these are the only ornaments he ever wears, right? We hear that as we mentioned in the previous class, Rupa Goswami describes him as wearing chandan tilak, or gorochana tilak, or this tilak, or that tilak. So it's not that these things are fixed as such, but they serve as a more than ample indicator, or a representative of the group, if you will. So this is a long passage. I'll just read the translation without the whole Sanskrit. I mean, the Sanskrit here is very simple, and I've given renderings for the Sanskrit names that he gives to the various ornaments anyway. So, he says, now, the ornaments of Sri Kṛṣṇa are described. The special amulets on his arms, placed there by his mother, are inlaid with the 9 jewels. So what is famously known as the Navaratnas, if anyone's familiar with astrology, they're well acquainted with these, or perhaps also with the Vrindavan traditions of the weekly cycle for dressing the Thakur is also said to be related to the 9 jewels. So these are the ruby, manikya, the pearl, mukta, coral, vidruma, emerald, marakata, yellow sapphire, pushparaga, diamond, vajra, blue sapphire, nila, hesonite, gomeda, and katsai, vaidurya. And there are also numerous Sanskrit words for each of these 9 jewels. I've just given examples here. They're often used in poetic contexts, and any words that come up frequently in poetry usually always have many synonyms because poets need to fit different chandas. So, anyway, the point is, Krishna's wearing amulets on his arms that Yashoda has put there, and these amulets are set with all 9 of these jewels. So, you can see there are some royal collections in Delhi and some places of the actual jewelry worn in the previous centuries by earlier rajas or their royal families, where jewelry literally made out of all of these jewels has been found in ancient temples or royal storehouses, and you can see examples of it. So amulets are on his arms, decorated with these 9 jewels. Then he has armlets on his upper arms called rangada, or givers of merriment. So the amulet is sometimes worn just beneath the elbow here, and sometimes a little bit above the elbow. And so the armlet would be something worn above the bicep, beneath the shoulder, so a bit higher up. And then we have the armlets are called rangada, so givers of merriment, and his bangles, so then lower down, so he's got on the wrist, on the middle of the arm, and on the upper arm, 3 layers. So the bangles on his wrists are called chankana, or literally chung sound makers, meaning they're named after the clinking sounds they make. So chung is just not a word, but it's just the sound. So chungka means that it's making the chung chung. So that's the way that they verbally depict the sound of the clinking of the metal. His signet ring is called ratnamukhi, that on the face of which are jewels. So in other words, he has a jeweled signet ring. His yellow garment is called Nigama Shobhana, the beauty of the town. In other words, when he wears it, catches everyone's eye as soon as he enters. His belled sash is called Kalajankara, that which jingles sweetly. And his anklets, the tinkling of which captures the doze of the hearts of doe eyes, namely the gopis, are called Hamsa Ganjana, they which surpass swans. So Rupa Goswami is a little playful here by saying that the gopis have both doe-like eyes and doe-like hearts, and that these are captured by the jingling of his anklets. So classically in Sanskrit poetry, the deer is said to be mesmerized or attracted by music or by sound. So it's as though the jingling of his anklets captures the hearts of the gopis. In other words, perhaps it's an allusion to this Aparanna Lila when Kṛṣṇa's returning in at what's called the Goduli Samoy, or the time where he's driving the cows back into the village, and as soon as any sound of Kṛṣṇa's return, is heard by those in the village, then they all scramble to get ready and come out either along the path or up on the roof or somewhere in the bushes to be able to watch Kṛṣṇa triumphantly return into the village in the evening after being gone for the day. So as they might hear his jingling ankle bells at this time, then that captures their hearts or brings them running in, if you will. And no doubt can apply to many other contexts. So swans are known to also warble in a charming manner, so this tinkling of his anklets is even better than that. And swans are also known to be graceful in their movements and appearance, so perhaps this is also an allusion to the gracefulness of his gait and the elegance of his feet. His pearl necklace is called Padyavali, or a constellation of stars. So as a string of pearls might resemble something like the Big Dipper, or a constellation that has a bright, a curved line of stars in it, something like that. This pearl necklace is compared to a string or a constellation of stars. And his jeweled necklace, so we've got a series of necklaces here. He's got a pearl necklace. On top of that, he's got a jeweled necklace, which is called Tarit Prabha, or that of lightning-like luster. So in other words, it's very bright. He has, in addition to this, a gold medallion in which an image of Radha is held, is called Hridaya Mohana, or delighting to the heart. His jewel by which the backwater inhabited by the serpent has been entered, and sometimes poetically things are spoken in a little bit of a roundabout way. I know this sounds a little bit funny in English, but it's just a roundabout way of referring to the Kaustuba jewel. So what he means, if you understand the backstory, is that by describing this as the jewel by which the backwater inhabited by the serpent has been entered, means this jewel that went into what's called the Daha, or this backwater off of the Jamuna where Kaliya lived. So when the jewel was transferred to Kaliya's treasury from the body of Sri Kṛṣṇa when he first appeared to Vasudeva and Devaki, and which was later gifted of itself to him by the hands of the wives of Kaliya, is known as Kaustubha, or that which comes from the ocean. So the one name of the ocean, which we discussed much earlier on here in the Padyavali, is Kaustubh. So because the Kaustubha jewel emerged from the ocean at the time of the churning by the Devas and Asuras, it was called the Kaustubh. And Kṛṣṇa was wearing the Kaustubh when he appeared to Vasudeva and Devaki, but when he morphed into a human-like child, then that jewel vanished and was imperceptibly transferred to the treasury of Kaliya. And then later, when Kṛṣṇa danced atop Kaliya's hoods and subdued him, then Kaliya's wives, as a tribute to Kṛṣṇa, offered him this jewel. So they didn't know that it originally belonged to him, but they thought it was just an excellent jewel that belonged to their husband, and so they offered it to him even though it was actually his own. So that's why Rupa Goswami gives this roundabout description here. So he has a pearl necklace, he has a jeweled necklace, he has a gold medallion, and he has the kostuba. So 4 layers are across the broad chest. And there's more in that sector, just wait. His earrings, which are makaras in shape, we've already talked about makaras, are called rati-ragadi-daivata, or they who are the tutelary deity of the raga of rati. That is the deity of the loving attachment of amorous love, madhura rati. And in a previous class we already talked about makaras, so I won't elaborate on that again. His diadem is known as ratnapara, or that which is covered with jewels. And his top knot is called chamara-damari, that which resembles a chamara. Now this part I especially like. Know the peacock plume named Navaratna-vidamba to be his crown. So the peacock feather plume is called Navaratna-vidamba, that which mocks the 9 jewels. In other words, the peacock feather is even more attractive than all the 9 jewels. And his gunjas, that is his dried gunja berry necklace, is called Ragavali. That is a creeper of loveliness or reddishness, rag meaning both love and redness. So his gunjas sometimes he may wear gunjas also as a necklace, or other times he can also wear them in like a wrap around the top knot as an accent. So perhaps due to the ordering of mention, it's thought here to be in the top knot rather than around the neck, but could go either way. And his tilak is called drishti mohana, or enrapturing to the eye. So now, more on the chest. His garland made of leaves and flowers extending down to his feet is called vanamala, or the forest garland. And that fashioned with flowers of 5 types is called the Vaijayanti, or the victory garland. So he has 2 garlands, plus 4 necklaces, plus perhaps also a gunja necklace, plus earrings, plus tilak, plus a diadem, plus a top knot, a decorated top knot, plus the peacock plume on the top, plus the bangles on the wrists, the armlets in the middle, and above, and then in the middle also another set of bracelets. So, this is how Rupa Goswami summarizes Krishna's attire. So when the verse under discussion says he's replete with the beauty of various ornaments, then something like this. In other words, it could also be any other variation, but this gives us some idea of what the author might have envisioned, or at least what Sri Rupapada does. The author's mention of, quote, all the desires sitting in our hearts refers to his desire to serve Sri Kṛṣṇa in the midst of his intimate leelas with Sri Radha and her Sakhis, as depicted in the verse under discussion. So, when he's envisioning Kṛṣṇa here, Kṛṣṇa's wearing the peacock chaplet, he's playing the flute, he's ornamented and he's surrounded by the gopis, he's delighting the eyes, and he's saying, if you would glance towards us then, in other words, when you're in the midst of that lila, that would fulfill our desires. So to receive a glance from Kṛṣṇa while he's engaged in that lila, what does that require? In other words, it requires that one already have all the else's that is required to be there at that time and have the sight of that. So, I forget now, who was it? Oh, I don't remember now, but there's one, it's in some Purana, some story where someone prays to Bhagavan, a woman was praying who had no son. I think she was praying to Yamaraj. Sorry, my memory is vague, but she prayed for a boon that her son would have 100 plates of gold or something like that. And then I think it was Yamaraj granted the boon, but she didn't have a son. So, and she was suffering from a curse or something where she didn't have a son, but because that boon was granted, then it overrided the other obstacle, and then she ultimately had a son. My memory is vague, but there's something like that, where when you pray for one thing that's the outcome of another, and that's granted, it automatically ensures that the intermediate element is also accomplished. So something like that, if the author is saying, if you would glance towards us while you're, dressed and playing the flute and delighting the eyes and engaged in this lila with the gopis, then the import of the prayer is that he wants to have a form and a bhav and everything required to be there at that time, because no one, but the gopis is privileged to be part of such confidential lila, and therewith to be able to participate and assist in such activities. So the author's mention of, quote, all the desires sitting in our hearts refers to his desire to serve Sri Kṛṣṇa in the midst of his intimate leelas with Sri Radha and her Sakhis, as depicted in the verse under discussion, as well as his desires to be accepted amongst Sri Radha and her Sakhis as as one of their own, to receive and reciprocate with Sri Kṛṣṇa's affection, and so forth. So, befittingly, perhaps, Rupa Goswami ends this section with an expression of longing that is also what we understand from his writing elsewhere to be very much akin to his own personal manner. So, that concludes the section on utkanta, or longing. So, now we come to another section, which is relatively short, just 3 or 4 verses, called Moksha Anadar. So this is something that has already been spoken of in a few verses earlier in the text, but is given more attention now, or is something Rupa Goswami returns to. So this we can also understand was something that Rupa Goswami really wanted to take care about. And we see in the Sindhu, he really spends a lot of time on this. When he brings up the concept of not desiring moksha, he quotes like 25 pramanas from the Bhagavatam and other Puranas and other previous Mahajans, and and so what can you infer? When an author makes a point and quotes 1 or 2 verses, then you understand he wants to instantiate what he's saying in the earlier tradition. When he quotes 25, it's obviously something that he wants to emphasize very strongly, and most likely he wants to preempt doubts or counter-arguments from arising on the subject matter. So usually someone, especially with the concision that writers of his era wrote, to cite 25 verses to instantiate the same principle, from a literal conceptual perspective, you might call a quote overkill, but rather you could say that it's you could take it as an instance of stuna kanananai, what is called pounding in the post, or from another perspective, you can consider it just relish of this very central, very rich pillar of the whole concept of Uttama Bhakti, which we know was something that was a significant feature of the Gaudiya Vaishnava movement, if you will, or was something that was a unique, not an 100% unique, but was coming into a greater degree of precision and flourishing in its articulation, if you will, through the writings of the Goswamis. And so you can see that they draw on the Bhagavatam. They have here statements Rupa Goswami is quoting here from earlier writers, and as we saw in the Brihad Bhagavatamrita lectures, when Sanatana Goswami raised the point, he also referred back to a verse of Vopadev in his work, and there you can see reference to the concept made in Hemadri's commentary on Vopadev's Muktafal text. So it was something that was conceived, that was in circulation in the 15th century, going into the early 16th century, maybe even as early as, the 14th century, there might have been some more vivid articulation of it. And Samipad is definitely laying the groundwork. He's definitely writing to that effect, although perhaps not everyone walked away from his work with a crystal clear, singular idea like that. We can see that the Goswamis, this was something that was very important to them, and they made very central to their ideology. So it's also interesting that although Rupa Goswami has already dealt with the topic earlier, he again revisits it, now, and that he visits it here at this juncture, just after these prayers of Utsukya, these prayers of Utkanta, where the whole theme is all about what are we eager for, what are we desirous of. Then he wants to make it clear that these statements that were made in the absolute sense, that they weren't made in an instrumental or an intermediary manner, because we can understand there being, a hierarchy of objectives that, sometimes you might say, people, all they want is money. They just want money, money, money. But actually, people don't truly want money. People want pleasure, or they want the things that money brings them. They want the sense of accomplishment, the sense of power, the sense of satisfaction, the sense of security, whatever. They want the ability to help others, all the different things that come to them from having money. So on the one hand, you might observe, and the person might talk about money all the time or endeavor to get money all the time. So you might say all this person wants is money. But at the same time, even when you say that, someone could hear that and understand that to be an intermediary desire, to understand that, all they want is money. But they don't take that statement in the absolute sense. They understand that to nevertheless still be an instrumental objective, or a desire that's only for a means, that's not actually the ultimate ends. So it appears, as per the way the commentator analyzes this, that Rupa Goswami wants to preclude people from assuming that about these statements regarding Utsukya and Utkanta that have just been described in the previous sections. Because a very pervasive notion is that moksha is the fourth and final ultimate purushartha. So many, for centuries prior to the writing of the Goswamis, considered bhakti to be the means to moksha, or one of a number of means to moksha. And this was common even among followers of the Advaita Varga, or, members who followed, generally speaking, what we would call the path of Gyan, meaning who adopted a form of Bhakti Mishra Gyan, or Jnana Mishra Bhakti in their pursuit of moksha. So persons from that orientation could read along, hear Vaishnav poetry like this, and say, oh, how nice. This is, rich expressions to nourish bhakti, which is our means to moksha. We like it. We approve. Kudos. Someone might, even without realizing it, or just based on common understanding, presuppose that this is the intended sense. So by following these statements about the desire or the utkanta or the utsukya for bhakti, for Bhagavan, for the darshan of Bhagavan, etc., to follow that by this section on disregard for moksha, then the emphasis is given that those desires that we just talked about, we're talking serious here. We weren't just talking about those in some instrumental or intermediate way towards moksha. We're talking full on. We're talking about this in contrast to moksha, over and above moksha, to the exclusion of moksha. So this is, you could say, one of the bold features of the concept of Uttama Bhakti, of the teachings of Mahaprabhu and the Goswamis, and is not 100% unique to them. As I mentioned, there are traces and usages of the same terms, and with nearly the same level of articulation or clarity also in some other Vaishnava communities. But with all due respect to that, we might, as Gaudiya Vaishnavas, assert that some special, refined, and pronounced articulation of this concept is unique to the canon of Gaudiya Vaishnava works. But if someone were to come along and prove otherwise, I would not be inclined to argue with them. I would applaud and say, I'm so glad to know that this concept is also richly appreciated and cherished by others as well, because we're not in the, my sampradaya is the best game, and we're not talking about all this just to try to make ourselves sound special, but we actually really care about this concept. So if it's articulated, if it's practiced by others, we feel brotherhood, we feel joy, we feel adoration, we feel respect, and certainly not an inclination to try to argue over who ought to be credited to this extent or that extent with this concept or that concept, or how much who drew from who. All these things are, to be understood as possible, but ultimately, we can't research every single text that's ever been written. We can't reconstruct, the intellectual culture of, a community 5 centuries ago completely. So we can't claim to have, absolute knowledge of these things. And personally, I don't believe we need to. But if we can, by discussing all of these things, actually deeply imbibe them into our hearts and actually, make a meaningful endeavor in our life to pursue them as ideals, that's really what's important and really what's beautiful. So, I'll just read here my intro. So thus concluding the section on Bhakta's expressions of longing, utkanta, the commentator sees it that the compiler considered that a reader at this stage in the text may still not have clearly grasped the import of many of the verses cited earlier that indicate that bhakti specifically, and not mukti, is the ultimate purushartha, the ultimate object to be longed for, and thus may foster the following objection. Quote, well, you say, those who are discerning and greatly wise, eagerly endeavor to attain the sight, service, and so forth of Sri Bhagavan. But that is not right, because of the propriety of acceptance of mukti directly. That is, it is not right to say that those who are discerning and greatly wise do not endeavor for mukti specifically, would not accept it if it was offered to them directly, instead endeavor only for that which is just a means to attaining mukti, namely bhakti, and do so even without, any desire to attain mukti for themselves, and irrespective of whether bhakti leads to them attaining mukti or not. So for persons from this orientation where mukti is the ultimate purushartha, this all sounds very backwards and strange. Since in the Shrutis and other Shastras, only muktis being the object to be attained, that is the ultimate purushartha, is enjoined. This is well known, this is well established. Moksha is the ultimate purushartha. Now you're saying you're going to reject the ultimate purushartha, and you're just going to busy yourself with the thing that's just a means to that ultimate purushartha? How is that? So to address this matter, thus the compiler next presents a section on disregard for moksha, to show the insignificance of mukti in comparison to bhakti, which alone is to be regarded as the object to be attained, that is, the ultimate purushartha and object of longing. So, this is how the commentator conceives of the context for this next prakaran. So, the commentary I have on this next verse is a little bit long, so I think I'll just end now, maybe just a little early, and we can start fresh from the discussion of the verses in this new prakaran in our next session. So, I'll let it rest here. If anyone has any comments or questions or corrections or any other feedback, they're welcome to share. Yes, I see. Vidiji, you have something?
Yes, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Jai Radha, Pranam. Thank you so much. So, Krishna's color, Kadamba color, Sham color, and gopis call him black. What's his color?
Sorry, did you say Kadamba?
I'm sorry.
You meant Tamal, maybe.
I'm sorry, Tamal tree, right? So very dark. Then we have Sham, rainy clouds, and then gopis call him straight black. And how, is there any defined colors that you can, visualize referring to Kṛṣṇa?
How are those descriptions deficient?
Not deficient. They give different impression of darkness, in my mind at least. Like, rainy clouds is one thing, but, Tamal tree is another one. It's very dark. And gopis call him like cloud, like dark, completely black. And so they're not contradictory, but perhaps there's just a reference, not exact description. But I find it like it just we know only that Krishna's body is blackish, but how exactly what kind of color is this is really hard to pinpoint, really, in my understanding. That's not more a question, but just, I'm just trying to raise this. So what comes to mind also is that Mother Yashoda, her color is some places mentioned as also dark, just like Krishna's. And I was wondering if you can, if you find those references and how would you harmonize? Because there's a lot, not always she's depicted as black, but then I don't know exact reference, but there are a few references in different other small secondary shastras that just indicate that Mother Yashoda was actually dark, just like Kṛṣṇa. So Arjuna and Draupadi and others, but I'm just wondering if you have any things to say about this.
Was it in, I forget if it was in Brihad Bhagavatamrita or another text. Just recently I was seeing, I think it was Sanatana Goswami, he was saying that that Yashoda is described as being of that dark, swarthy complexion in some texts, and in others not. He's acknowledging that there's differences among different earlier works. And so we see that in some of the descriptions within the literature of our Goswamis, the reference to the darker complexion is made. In other cases, it's not specified as directly.
So there's no...
So, personally, when it comes to... Excuse me?
Yes?
Okay. Are you saying something?
No.
Okay.
I'm listening.
So personally, when someone like Sanatana Goswami, I believe it was either Sanatana Goswami or Jiva Goswami, wherever I was reading this statement a few days ago, one of the two, if someone like that is explaining why they've made a description that they've made, and then they're saying, well, this text says it's like this, and this text says it's like that, so I've put it like this. To me, it's evident that there's a recognition for the literary tradition that pre-existed these writers, and they're continuing that, and they want to preserve that. But what I personally also draw from that is that those kind of details are not of the essence, or of the essence for a sadhaka. And one of the, you could say, main principles that we get from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is this idea that Bhagavan is perceived by the agency of the Sarup Shakti. Rasa is relished only by those who have a sthayi bhav. So, and Jiva Goswami articulates this in the Priti Sandarbha, explaining how the Sarup Shakti descends and, so to speak, hacks the functioning of the buddhi and the manas and the indriyas of the person, kind of like a SWAT team, busts in and takes over a ship of an enemy or a helicopter of an enemy or something like that, and then is, operating this system according to its own interests. Something like this, the agency of the Sarup Shakti is descending there, and it's actually the instrumental, means by which the person comes to have this perception and experience. So, the exact details of how someone as a sadhaka who's yet to reach that stage, I personally don't think that Bhagavan or the Brajaparikaras are going to be sitting there like some inspector, going okay, are the details of this guy's meditation all matching properly these texts or not? Okay. We've got this tantra, we've got this smriti, and oh look, he's fouling out on the eyebrows, but yeah, the clarity of his meditation on the shape of the earrings is all right, but, the color of the lips is a bit off, it's is that how the value or the depth or the content of someone's sadhana is evaluated, so to speak? Or is that what will be directly causative in a person reaching success? Personally, I feel that there's a certain degree of attentiveness to detail which is natural and which is appreciable and which is a gesture or an expression of responsibility and care for the process. So to just be none of it matters. Maybe the exact details of what someone meditates on don't ultimately matter, but an attitude of trying to attend to them with care, that bit matters, But then exactly, how learned the person is or how many of these details may corroborate with which text or this, personally, I don't see that that's going to be the ultimate grounds of evaluation. And something I've also referred to in the past, there's a statement of Vishwanath Chakravartipad on, I believe it's the second verse in the 87th chapter of the 10th canto, where he explains that ultimately all perception of Bhagavan occurs only by the grace of Bhagavan and is never accomplished by means of the meditation or the hearing or the kirtan or the this or the that anyone does. But it's when the bhakta, through those activities, shows their eagerness, shows their effort, shows their intensity of desire, that evokes the grace of Bhagavan to reveal himself and give persons the quote-unquote actual or direct experience. So, as aspiring practitioners, to show eagerness, to show affinity for the process, naturally some of that affinity is going to spill over into wanting to have a relatively clear concept of details like this. So I see it as partial but not absolute. In other words, that, we might look at, like I gave this whole thing from the Radha Krishna Ganodesh Dipika, where he's giving the names of all these, there's fair bit of detail out there on some of these things, and so why not, But at the same time, consideration for that kind of detail, in my personal opinion, and as we know in the viewpoint of our Guru Maharaj, can definitely become excessive and can definitely lead someone off the track, so to speak, where they're more preoccupied with procedural meditational detail than they are with the whole purpose of the meditation itself and the underlying requisites and the overall spirit of the sadhana process. So in that way, it's something that, to the best of my understanding, is, it's something that you want to care about, but within the right kind of bounds, if you will. So when it comes to these descriptions of Krishna's complexion or Krishna's figure, then there is some variety. Poets have used different types of metaphor. As we know, what can poets do? What is the material that the whole genre of kavya literature is based on? It's based on empiric perception. So everything is essentially a comparison of the supermundane to something of the mundane. And nothing of the mundane will ever be exactly like the supermundane object, reverence for which, or adoration for which, or desire for which is attempting to be evoked by the comparison. So poets perhaps, and I'll add to that, and how do people perceive or relish features of the world or of the empiric plane? Not everyone's relish of that is completely the same. There are objects that are, you could say, more or less universal objects of adoration, like the lotus flower and the moon and the ocean and things like this that we hear so much in the poetry. His face is like the moon, his feet are like the lotus, his grace is like the ocean, etc., etc. These are, very common metaphors that are based on more or less universal recognition for things. But nevertheless, there are also poems where poets might express or use objects of comparison that are a little bit less universal and perhaps more specific to their personal taste. I can say for myself, prior to ever reading poetry about Kṛṣṇa, I don't think I'd ever heard a poem that had used rain clouds specifically as an object of comparison to evoke a concept of beauty. And I can't say that in my personal experience, I've certainly been in some rainstorms before, but this idea that the glistening appearance of a rain cloud would be specifically an object that I would think of that would be a standard that would convey a sense of something deeply aesthetically pleasing, at least to the best of my knowledge, I don't remember ever having thought like that until ever reading poetry where you're hearing about Shyama-Sundar and you're hearing about, all this poetry describing his complexion or his luster to that of clouds. So I just say that to say that for some poets, for some people, that might be a standard of, an object of comparison that is, immediately recognize, oh, wow, that just evokes a great sense of adoration. And maybe for others, the tumultuary is something more attractive and beautiful. I can say for myself, the first time I ever really saw a tumultuary in real life, I can't say I was overwhelmed by the beauty of, I grew up in redwood forests from California. I think redwood trees are beautiful, massive sequoias that are 10,000 years old and wider than a house, I saw some pretty awesome trees as a kid, so seeing this kind of thin, irregular, dark bark of the tamal, I can't say I was immediately wow, but at the same time, over time, I can say it grew on me, to the point where I could see this kind of the rich darkness of the bark. It was I could see how it was attractive. And I remember even having acquired that taste, if you will, one time being with someone who had never been to India, and then saying, hey, look, and here's a tamal tree. And they're where? And I'm right here. And they're wait, but where? And I'm the one I'm pointing at in front of you. And they're that one? They weren't impressed, by the immediate appearance of the tamal, they were assuming that I couldn't have been pointing to that one because that one wasn't so attractive. Anyway, I don't mean to go off too long on this, but just to say that maybe there's a place for a variety of objects of comparison for poets to use. And as sadhakas, we can remember what's the purpose of all this poetry? How does it relate to us as aspirants? All the purpose of this poetry is to ultimately to conjure, or deepen the samskar for bhakti, to conjure a depth of desire for prapti-abhilas, seva-abhilas. This is what it's all for. So there's also a place for individuals favoring the poetry that works for them. In other words, this is Rupa Goswami's poetry collection. He picked these poems. There's obviously poems that were in a bunch of the collections that he drew from, like the Sad Ukti Karnamrita. There's also a bunch of poems in there that he excluded, So, he obviously had some aesthetic criterion by which he was making his selections. So, I would just say that, there's poems or there's comparisons that we might think depict the complexion of Kṛṣṇa a little bit more, quote, dark, but maybe on the lighter side or the more bluish side or the, going towards a grayish or a glossy side. There's others that might sound a more rich, deeper, darker tone, and similarly, we see deities of Kṛṣṇa that some are dark black, some are sky blue, some are gold, some are white, there's marble deity, there's gold brass deities of Kṛṣṇa, so in the mind's eye of various bhaktas, people find many different, countenances of Kṛṣṇa to be worthy of worship or, to be satisfying to their heart. So I personally would just say that the aim of this genre of literature is not, so to speak, to be like scientifically literal or, to break it down like, okay, we've got the exact hex tag of Kṛṣṇa's complexion, this by cross analysis of 1,500 shlokas, we've now averaged out the different metaphors used, and we've made an analysis of modern color wheels, and this is the hex tag. We've got it nailed down. You know what I mean? Anyone who meditates on this hex tag is going to Goloka, and anyone who doesn't get our hex tag, we pray for. Whatever. I'm being facetious here.
No, but it shows actually that the nitty-gritty is not required.
Right. That we don't need to be overly preoccupied with those kind of details, and that we want to imbibe the poetry in a way that the main purpose of it is to nourish our hearts, nourish our longing, nourish our translation of that also into substantial Vaishnava behavior and substantial Vaishnava practice, and along with that to, sorry, I had something else to say there. It slipped my mind. Anyway, I said a bunch of things. So, how does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds very good. I also would say that the metaphors are dependent on the cultural context or geographical context. For example, in other traditions, where lotus doesn't exist, they use rose as a comparison. The same partnership.
They use what? Sorry.
They use rose.
A rose.
As a replacement for lotus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Sure.
As you said, it's just personal choice of who's writing.
Yeah. Okay. It came back to my mind. I was just going to tie back to that statement of Vishnu Chakravarti, where he says that he depicts the sadhaka doing meditation on Kṛṣṇa from Kṛṣṇa's perspective. And he says that when Kṛṣṇa sees the bhakta trying to meditate on him based on all this poetry and based on all these comparisons to things of the world that he's heard, then Kṛṣṇa's pleased and he thinks, oh look, he's trying. In other words, he's pleased with the effort. He's pleased with the devotional gesture. So, in other words, it's not that you're ever really going to impress him with the level of so-called accuracy or, how accurate is your mundane ever going to be of the super mundane. So that you satisfy him, that Kṛṣṇa feels the pleasure. Look, there's my bhakta, letting aside all other things to give his mind, to give his time to me. That look what love he has for me. That is endearing to him. So if we think of it from that side, then we can try in our tiny little way, to make our meager endeavor and pray that he's pleased.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's quite extensive elaboration. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers.
All right, well, we can conclude here for the evening, if that's all right. And if we're so blessed, then in our next session, we will dive into this prakaran on moksha anadar, disregard even for moksha. Vaishnavibhyo namo namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Jai, thank you.
Jai, thank you for the class.